Today, I am on the floor, apparently, with my retro rebuilt PC. That's basically my time machine to the early 2000s. We're gonna take a look inside this machine, break down the parts that power it, and even find out what each component would cost if you wanted to build something like this yourself, versus how much I paid to skip that part and have it set up for me. But more than that, I'll share why I even wanted a computer like this in 2025, and also why it's become one of the most joyful parts of my creative process. This is my retro computer. It's a little bit beefier than the e-machines with a 40GB hard drive that I had as a kid, but I can't wait to tell you about it. This computer runs both Windows XP and Windows 7 and can handle mid-2000s audio projects and video editing from the Pinnacle Studio and early Adobe Creative Suite days. Back when you could buy it for one price in a beautiful case like this and keep it forever until they shut off the activation servers so that you can't use it anymore. But that's a story for another day. Before I crack open the case, literally, I want to talk about why I wanted a PC like this, and it's not the reason that most people think. Because most people who build a retro-inspired PC want it specifically for gaming purposes. But I'm not a gamer by most standards. My favorite games can pretty much run on a potato from 1999. I grew up with games like Roller Coaster Tycoon, edutainment software like Explorapedia or the Magic School Bus games, and my favorite games were DOS games like Cosmos Cosmic Adventures, Duke Nukem, and Jill of the Jungle, which all of those I think were released in the early 90s. So clearly I don't need power for those things. But as someone who's been making music and videos for over 20 years, I often draw inspiration from the past. And it's not just memories, because I'm inspired from the actual tools from back then. And I know that might sound strange, but to me there is a certain magic in using the same software and sounds that I used as a kid or a teen in the early 2000s. Have you ever heard of the Comic Sans trick? I've heard some people talk about it where they use Comic Sans, the font, to write their papers or their college thesis. And they'll find that they write more and write more effectively while using that font, simply because the font is so unserious. So it kind of removes that mental block that some people have with starting, because what does it matter? It's just Comic Sans. It's not real. And just having that block removed helps them to write more than they would have had they used a more serious font, like Times New Roman or Helvetica. This computer is kind of like the Comic Sans trick, but for creativity. When I was creating as a kid or a teenager, I never in my wildest dreams expected that anyone would see it. And I mean, most of the stuff sat on my hard drive for 20 years before I ever even put it online at all. The point was that I was creating just for the sake of creation. It's hard to get over that now as someone who shares their work online, or at least some of it, because I'm always wanting to make sure I'm doing it for the right reasons. You know, am I doing it because I love to and not just because I'm chasing metrics or views? I want to allow my work to be seen, but also make sure that I am enjoying the process. And this helps me ground myself a little bit. I feel like I probably shouldn't be like throwing this around outside, and I'm sure I'm gonna get a lot of comments that are like, you're gonna ruin your computer. While I grew up starting with Windows 3.1 and then Windows 95 and 98, by the time that I actually started using a computer to create things, it was Windows XP for me. That's the operating system where I recorded my first songs, edited my first videos, and learned how to poorly edit photos in Photoshop. Fast forward to now, and I do get a lot of comments about being stuck in the past and how all of this is useless, and obviously I disagree. I think some of those people aren't considering that to make these videos happen, I also have to have a modern editing workstation and new cameras and equipment and capture software and all of that. So it's almost like I need to be more in the future to be able to even capture the past. But the problem about modern computers is that when it comes to running old school software, this modern equipment is too new. There are compatibility issues, there's missing support for old file formats or hardware, and of course emulators and virtual machines are an option, but for me it just feels like a sad imitation. I am someone who, for better or worse, needs the authentic experience. I want real hardware running real Windows XP just as it would have in that era, but with a few modern conveniences sprinkled in. It's like the soul of 2003, but with the reliability of 2023-ish. Now let's talk about the specs and what's inside this computer. This rig may be retro-inspired, but its guts are actually a clever mix of 2010s hardware chosen to excel at 2000s tasks. Now, as I said previously, I paid a premium to purchase this computer pre-built to save time so that I could get to the part that I really wanted, which was using the software and hardware to actually make something. So to make this part fun, I'm going to put the approximate price you'd pay for all the components in the secondhand market and compare that to what I paid for the pre-built version with all the drivers installed ready to go. Prices were approximated from mainly eBay as a source, and obviously prices may vary. Let's get started.
Hey, wait!
The brain of this PC is a chip that originally launched in 2012, the Xeon E3-1225. As far as I could tell, it's actually just a beefed up Intel Core i5. This quad-core processor runs at 3.2 GHz with turbo up to 3.6 GHz. It was originally meant for workstations and servers, which means it was built for stability. When it first came out, this CPU cost about $200. You can find the Xeon E3-1225 for about $10 to $20 on the used market right now, oftentimes even less. For graphics, I have the NVIDIA Quadro K620, which was released in mid-2014 for around $150. It has a low power draw of only 45 watts, and the architecture is similar to the GTX 750 series, which had more power for gaming. But for my needs, which are mostly games released prior to 2008, and using older versions of software like Premiere CS3, this GPU has enough power without being noisy or requiring too much energy. You can get this card or a similar card secondhand for about $20. This machine has 4 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM installed. Now 4 gigabytes sounds tiny compared to today's standards where 16 gigabytes is common and kind of the base now, but for my purposes it's plenty. To put it in perspective, when Windows XP launched in 2001, a typical PC had maybe 256 megabytes of RAM. And to be clear, this is Windows XP, the 32-bit version, which can only support up to 4 gigabytes of RAM. Windows 7 can use the full amount and run smoothly for most tasks, but I may upgrade this in the future just for the Windows 7 side, although Windows XP will always be limited to 4 gigabytes. And even that amount has caused me to run into some problems in Windows XP. For example, when playing with Sound Recorder, I actually encountered an error that stated I didn't have enough memory. And after looking into it, I found that design limitations in Sound Recorder actually cause this error to appear if you have more than 2 gigabytes of memory, and Microsoft has actually confirmed this issue. These days, RAM costs almost nothing, especially if you're looking at relatively small sizes like 4 gigabytes. You can get one 2 gigabyte stick of DDR3 desktop RAM for about $6. So for this build, I'll say the RAM costs about $15 just to account for shipping and fees. For storage, my retro PC ditches a traditional spinning hard drive of the era and instead uses a 256 gigabyte Lexar solid state drive as the primary hard drive. This is a big deal for 2 reasons: capacity and speed. I specifically remember my first personal computer that was actually mine. It was, if I can remember correctly, an E-Machines that was purchased from Sam's Club around 2003 or 2004, and I think it had a 40 gigabyte hard drive, and I thought I would never fill it. And spoiler alert, I did. So having this solid state hard drive means that Windows XP boots up really fast and programs open without hesitation. A 2.5-inch 256 gigabyte internal SSD drive will run you about $25 to $30. And also in the build is a good old-fashioned CD, DVD, RW drive, because what's a retro PC without optical media, right? I can pop in old software or burn mix CDs for that genuine 2003 music sharing experience. A CD, DVD drive with writing capabilities will run you about $30, and this would not include the ability to write or play Blu-rays, so that would be extra if you wanted that. The motherboard is an Intel DH61WW, which is an LGA 1155 socket board from the early 2010s. It is a solid, no-frills board, but the fun part is all the retro-friendly ports that it provides. The board also has integrated HD audio for sound. When I'm not recording audio with a cheap mic in the mic port, I do use an era-appropriate USB interface. This is actually the first interface I ever owned. My parents bought this Tascam US 122, and I've kept it ever since, and it still works. So I can use this when I want to record with something a little bit beefier on this Windows XP computer, especially if it's a mic that needs phantom power. This specific Intel motherboard will run you about $30 to $40, including shipping. And I did add a FireWire card to this build, which I installed in a previous video, and it was chaotic, and I'm not even sure that it's working now. I think it is. It was my camera that broke. That was the problem. If you want to add a FireWire card, that'll cost you about $30. This whole setup lives inside a compact micro ATX case. It's nothing flashy. It's just a simple black box. The price of the tower itself can vary greatly, and the biggest issue with this one is that shipping is cumbersome. So I would try to find a case secondhand with local pickup, or find one in your basement somewhere. Otherwise, I've seen them for about $55 with shipping. Lastly, you'll also need a power supply, which for this build, that's a PowerMan 350 watt power supply, which I've seen for about $20 to $30, including shipping. As far as operating systems, I've got Windows XP 32-bit and Windows 7 64-bit installed in a dual boot setup. This means when I turn on the PC, I can choose whether I want to jump into 2002 or 2010, depending on what I plan to do. So the total, if you build yourself and buy all the parts off eBay or a similar secondhand market, is about $240. What I paid for the pre-built option, including all setup with drivers and the dual boot system, was $371.38. Obviously, if you shop around, you could probably get a much better deal on parts. So I bet you could get your build even cheaper, especially if you have some parts hanging around somewhere in your closet. Now for the fun part, what is it actually like to use this machine? Now, I haven't really stress tested it with fancy games yet, mostly because that's not what I envisioned it for. But what have I done? I've done some music compositions with some of my favorite early 2000s DAWs, and I've edited a few videos using era-appropriate tools, and it's handled all of that beautifully. No crashes, no lag, and minimal weird compatibility bugs. It boots fast, it loads software quickly, and the whole experience feels right. For those interested in benchmarks, I did run some just for informational purposes. Considering I know virtually nothing about benchmarks when it comes to gaming performance, I really can't help much in breaking down the scores and what they mean. So if you're knowledgeable about the subject, I would love to hear your thoughts. But anyway, these are the results for 3D Mark 05 on Windows XP. And these are the results for 3D Mark Vantage on the Windows 7 side. Just for fun, I also wanted to give it a real-world gaming test, and so I picked a game I've never played before, which is The Sims. I've played all sorts of tycoon games, and I love them, like Zoo Tycoon or SimCity, but I've never played just The Sims, any version. So while this probably isn't really a great test for the performance of the computer, it's really fun to experience it for the first time. But I do need more time. I only played for like a half an hour. At this point, you might be thinking, this is cool and all, but isn't it a lot of effort just to run old stuff? And that's fair. But for me, this journey isn't just for nostalgic purposes. It's more about rediscovering the joy of creativity with limited yet charming tools. Why, hello. So I asked if anyone had any questions about my computer or my setup, and I'm going to answer some of those questions. So one of the first questions was about my CRT monitor. What do I use it for? And in my studio, I have the CRT monitor. It's actually behind me from where I'm working. And I didn't buy it for a specific purpose other than the aesthetic enjoyment of it, for lack of a better word. I just wanted to be able to hear the hum of the monitor and see things kind of authentically to how I would have seen them when I was a kid, because that's part of where my creative process stems from. And for some projects in the future, I'll probably be using that as my main monitor, but honestly, it kind of freaks my eyes out because of the refresh rate. So most of the time, I just have it running behind me, and I don't always have it on. Somebody asked, have you watched Thomas and Friends? No. I had a comment that said, retro computer. I agree. One commenter asked, how did you choose the parts for the PC? Any compatibility issues along the way? And as you know, this one was already pre-built when I bought it. But as far as what I was looking for if I were to build it myself, you kind of have to hodgepodge your way through it a little bit, because parts that you may really want, you might not be able to find. But as far as where I was sourcing those parts from, eBay was one source that I was looking for parts. I also find a lot of computer parts that are a lot older at local swap meets and hamfests, very rarely at rummage sales and yard sales, Facebook Marketplace, and just asking around if you know anyone in the business who might have old computers or systems that they're getting rid of. So it's not a perfect answer, but that's where I was going to find most of my parts. One commenter asked, is the PC built with hardware from the era you were going for, or is it relatively new and running older software? And it's definitely relatively newer hardware and running older software. That way we get a little bit more reliability, which is nice without compromising on the performance of Windows XP. I have a lot of commenters ask if I have this hooked up to the internet or if I have any of my older computers hooked up to the internet, and no, I do not. I know that there are security concerns with putting these machines on the internet, and so no, I keep them completely offline. One commenter asked why I'm using this boring case instead of something more era appropriate, and to be quite honest, I didn't really care so much about the aesthetic of the machine in general. It's kind of hidden away next to my desk, and so while one day I might look into putting it in a more era appropriate case, it just wasn't a priority at the moment. It does its job, so it's fine. Now, I did have some comments about how to go about working through the driver compatibility for if you were building it yourself. And as far as that goes, in the past I've used resources such as Phil's Computer Lab. Reddit has been a great resource, looking through specific subreddits for building your own computers. It's kind of difficult, to be quite honest, to go through all of the drivers, but a lot of these resources have built up a big, huge library of helpful articles and information for you to go through and find what you need. So it's not as hard as it would have been in the past. One place to always check if you're looking for an older driver for something is on the Internet Archive if you can't find it online, because a lot of these companies remove their old drivers from their websites, which can be a bit of a bummer, but I understand why they do it, because most people don't need a Windows XP driver from 2004. And that's why it's really helpful if you do have old drivers and things like that to upload them when you can, if you don't see it available anywhere else online. Sometimes if I come across an old disk that I have with drivers on it, I'll go and search it up online or on the Internet Archive and just confirm whether or not it's on there, because if it's not, I should probably put that up there, because you just never know who might be looking for it. If you're interested in seeing some of the software that I use or some of the things that I make with these old computers, these two videos are a great place to start. Thanks for watching today's episode of Crazy Hark's Amazing Emporium of Total Retro Madness, and sometimes other things too.